So when you're going into 3D Coat, probably one of the biggest things that you'll notice, and this is kind of like any other program that you're starting out with, is that the user interface could either be anywhere between daunting to simple to just very different. And for me, anyway, 3D Coat was just different and to some degree very simple. Now, originally, it didn't look like this. I started out with version 3, and so it didn't. It had a menu that came up, but it didn't look like this. So if yours looks different, you're using probably a different version, and that's okay. Most of the main functions in 3D Coat and most of the layout is more or less the same. So one thing that you'll see is that there is the screen is basically divided into various sections. The main part here is your viewport, which is like every 3D program I can think of has a viewport. And essentially, on the left side, you have painting tools, because right now we see that we're on the Paint tab. It's highlighted in orange up here towards the top left. So we have paint tools in respect to what room we're in, and that's what they call them, is these rooms. I call them tabs, but essentially I'll refer to them as rooms because that's what the 3D Coat community refers to them as. But you have the paint room, the tweak room, the Retopo room, the UV room, the voxels room, and the render room. And each one of those has a different set of layout options. I don't even want to say brushes. It's only brushes if it's applicable, but tools that appear in any number of different areas. And you can tweak this to your liking. And that's one of the biggest benefits to 3D Coat I can think of, other than the fact that you're working with voxels and you don't have to think about how you're sculpting things. You can just sculpt them. It goes beyond just sculpting. You can use this program in so many different ways. So let's talk about this layout. The very top here is where you can find your menu items of various with various tools and methods and features. Probably the most helpful of which, of course, is going to be your help section. But your community in 3D Coat is very awesome, and you even have a direct link to that community through this button right here. Under the help menu, and you can click on that and it takes you straight over there, and they are probably the most helpful, if not one of the most helpful communities I've ever seen. To the right of this, you have other tools, and just below it you have other tools in relation to the room that you're in. We won't go over all of those because these rooms really sort of mandate their own set of instructions and tutorials and videos than this one will cover. But essentially, that's what these tools are in relation to, is the paint room, because that's what we're on right now. So we have paint tools on the left. We have some options towards the top. We also have a color palette. We have a set of brushes, options for brushes, strips for brushes, models for brushes. And again, we won't go into what all those are right now. We'll just realize that that is what is there in relation to this particular room. We also have materials and masks that we can deal with. The Vox tree normally isn't there. Now, I put that in there myself. Like I said, you can tailor the user interface any way that you want, literally, almost literally. I almost want to say I can think of a few exceptions you can't do, but for the most part, you can tweak this to your heart's desire. The other thing that you would normally see is layers and blending, but I added objects and materials down here as well. And these materials are actually different from the materials up here. They're a little bit different, but don't get confused by it. It'll make more sense as we go later on in the course. But the bottom line is, to get to those, all I had to do is go to Windows, pop-ups, and drag, like basically pull up a palette, let's say layer blending, and then drag it down where I want, and then pop it into, say, this panel, and then I've got blending here, or I can put it over here in this one, or I can float it up here, or I can put it to the side. In some cases, it really is a very tailorable user interface. The other thing that you'll see is at the bottom, you have some data that will show, your polygon count if you're dealing with polygons, let's say in the Retopo room, or it may show like memory. It may show some other operations that are going on. I guess another part of this, and it's a little bit hidden, but it is very critical, is this section right here, just at the top right of your viewport. And so we have settings like adjusting your ambient lighting, adjusting the primary light, the angle of the light, and where it's coming from. You have different translation tools, scale, rotation, etc. But the ones I use the most are toggling between perspective and orthographic view. Sometimes the grid can become handy, or the axis. And then the other thing might be toggling full screen on and off, but I usually don't use that very much. But anyway, this menu here gets you started, but you don't have to use this menu. In fact, you can just close it and just go to one of these rooms. But let me just start with that menu again. I'll just open it up again as a new file. I didn't want this up anymore. So let's get rid of those. So I can go to voxel sculpting. If I want to just paint over a model that has already been done, I can go into paint over model vertices, and it'll put me in the correct place. Paint directly over a UV model, one that has already had the UV set up before going into 3D Coat, and it will walk you, through. It's all more or less wizard driven to some degree. But the exception might be where if I want to go into voxel sculpting, I can start with a blank room, open a file, which could be an OBJ or an FBX, and then I can also just start with one of these other shapes here, and then it'll take me straight over to the voxel room. And notice now that I'm in the voxel room, not only does it set me up with something that I can sculpt with, which I chose to be a sphere, but I actually have tools over here that represent functions that I can perform in the voxel room. I have a vox tree, which essentially is the setup of the voxels in here. So this particular voxel shape is referred to as volume 223. But I can double click on this in that vox tree and name it sphere or whatever I want, and hit enter to commit it. Root always stays there, but essentially anything under the root would be either another layer where you can put more voxels on. So you can have different parts with different shapes. In fact, let's say I do that. Let's add a primitive to this. Let's go down to primitives, and we'll move this over. We'll make it a little smaller and hit enter to commit. And now that that's added to the screen, I have two different layers. I have one with a sphere and one with a square. In fact, or I should say cube. And I can actually drag these up or down as I see fit to reorder them. But this would also allow me to utilize these shaders. So I can assign, say, a blue shader to my my sphere, and I did that by clicking on the layer that it's on and assigning the material. And then if I go to cube, I can give it another one. And as I said before, you can adjust the lighting to your liking. You should be able to move it around. There's something to do with the way this particular version is working right now, because and I say that some shaders won't allow you to adjust the angle of the lighting. They're sort of baked in, so to speak. But let's say I go to this one. I think this one will work. Oops, didn't mean to do that. Well, that's okay. So let's go with, let's find just a standard shader if I can. Some of these shaders allow you to adjust where the lighting is coming from them, and some of them lock them down. So that is something else to be aware of. And I'm not sure why this is happening, because some of these should be working. So there's a sort of a problem right now, I guess, with, okay, there we go. So some of them work in relation to direction of lighting and some of them don't. So it's okay. You don't have to be stuck with this, because all these they're not actually assigned to the model so that when you go and export the model, they have those colors. These are just to help you see what they might look like on the screen as voxels. You can bake these colors and say, if we go with this one, these sort of jagged edges and dark areas, you can bake those in. In other words, basically set it up so that they come out with that, but it takes a little bit of work, and it's not hard, but it's not something that comes out by default. You have to put it in there, but you literally can change those around. In the render room, you have different ways of setting up your render settings so that you can see a more, I should say, cleaner, maybe a better looking perspective or image, and to some degree even a turntable of your sculptures or whatever the shape is. You have the UV room, which in this case, we haven't done anything where we can UV it, but essentially you can set up your UV maps in this room, and essentially you have different tools that pop up for that. The Retopo room, you have tools where you can literally just put in, start putting in actual polygonal geometry. So like I can put point, 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 right click, and then I have an actual shape there. In fact, I can divide it. To add in polygonal geometry to your sculptures or anything that you import is super easy in some ways in 3D Code. Some people have some issues with it, and we can go over those as we get on with the course. But essentially what I have is, instead of just the Vox tree here, in fact, the Vox tree normally isn't here. I just went to Windows pop-ups and clicked on Vox tree and dragged it down here so that I always have it in my Retopo room. Personally, I think it should always be there by default, but it's not. But essentially, the Retopo groups, you can literally retopologize this cube with any number of different meshes and set them up in different layers and turn them on and off as you see fit and export those as you see fit. The tweak room you usually use after you've done everything else, generally either before or after the paint room, and essentially you can use it to tweak kind of where the shape bulges in or out or whatever. You could do some limited operations to that even after you've UV unwrapped it. So that's a super powerful feature that you can't really find in just about any application I can think of. But essentially that's the layout. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask, and we'll talk about more a little bit later. I hope to be covering the controls and selections, because I think those are very important as well.